All right, well, today's lesson is going to be about writing commentary for the rhetorical analysis essay, which is FRQ number 2. So what I'm going to do today is what's called a think aloud, and I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts and my process, what's going through my head when I'm approaching a text and I'm thinking about how I'm going to write the commentary. Sometimes students think that you're either good at writing commentary or you're not, but actually there are some steps and strategies that I can share with you, and you can see that it's not always easy for me either. And so hopefully that will give you some place to start when you practice writing your own commentary. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to have you do is you're going to pause this video and you're going to open Patrick Henry's full speech. It's his speech to the Virginia Convention in 1775. And if you can print it, that'd be great. But I'd like you to annotate and underline, circle rhetorical choices that you think were especially convincing for his audience. So that could be things like diction that you think has a lot of connotation, or specific details that you think are really important and compelling. It could be syntax that you think is especially powerful. It could be comparisons. It could be descriptions. It could be causes and effects, compare and contrast, all those kinds of things. So go ahead and pause, open and read, and then push play again when you're ready. Okay, now that you have finished reading the text, it's always important to remember for question number 2 to consider the soapstone elements, because you really want to make sure that you're anchored in the text. You know exactly who's talking and what's going on, and that will help you get a deeper understanding of those nuances of the text. So the S stands for speaker, the O stands for occasion, which is also like the context, or the exigence, which is the urgency that prompted the writing of the piece or the delivery of the language. The A stands for audience, P is for purpose or desired change. The S is the stylistic choices, those rhetorical choices. And the tone is the speaker's attitude or feeling toward his or her subject. So there they are again. And I'm just going to kind of go through my own thinking, like I said, as I consider the soapstone elements to help me better understand, more deeply understand the text. So of course the speaker is Patrick Henry, that's obvious, but I'm always wondering, okay, well, what else is important about him? What does he do? You know, how is he viewed? What's important to him? So I know he's a statesman. I know he's a respected lawyer. So I know he's educated, and I know he's really passionate about the revolution and freeing themselves and finding independence. So those are just some qualities about him that I always consider. I always think about, when he lived and what was going on, and all of that will help me. The O is for occasion. I know the speech was delivered in 1775, which was right on the eve of the revolution. So the whole atmosphere at the time was about war and change, and the Intolerable Acts petition had just been sent to King George recently. So feeling like there's some shift that's happening or there's some action that needs to be taken urged him, that was his exigence, to deliver this speech. The A is for audience, and I always try to think about okay, so put myself in the audience in that particular time, in that particular place. And who were these people that he was trying to convince? Well, they were fellow delegates of the Virginia Convention. They were men. They were white men, because those were the only men who could hold that kind of position. And they could vote. They were the ones who had the power to change, to make change. They were also probably fathers and husbands. They were grown adults. So there are things that would be important to them, protective things, protecting their family, protecting their loved ones, making sure that their children got to grow up and be independent and free as a nation. So all those kinds of things I really like to think about and consider, because that makes me better understand what language in a piece would be convincing. So the purpose is to make, hopefully, to convince the delegates to vote to take defensive action against the British troops, instead of continuing to just allow them to come in with their armies and their navies and to continue to tax them and things like that. The stylistic choices that stood out for me, and these are certainly not all of them, but rhetorical questions. He poses a lot of rhetorical questions, cause and effect, so talking about the things that they've done and the effect and how those actions were met from the British Crown. Allusion, specifically, there is an allusion to the sirens, which is a mythological allusion. Metaphors, so those comparisons, and selection of detail. Those were the ones that stuck out for me, but you might have picked some other ones too, and that's totally fine. So tone is the speaker's attitude toward his or her subject. And, as I'm reading it, I know that he has stood in front of the other delegates, and at the end of the speech where he says, "Give me liberty or give me death," it's believed that he picked up a letter opener and then made a thrusting motion toward his heart. So I know he's passionate, he's patriotic, he feels very strongly about what he thinks they need to do. He's incensed, which just means very, very angry about how they're being treated, and he's determined and confident. So knowing all of these elements really helps me understand better why he uses the language he uses and why it worked. So I picked two passages from this speech to kind of walk through and again do a think aloud for you so you can kind of see how I process and approach. And maybe there are some strategies that can work for you as well. So these are the first two lines of the speech. He says, "No man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as abilities of the very worthy gentlemen who have just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights, and therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to those gentlemen if, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall speak forth my sentiments freely and without reserve." So again, these are the two first sentences of the speech, and it's a little bit older text. It was delivered in 1775, so oftentimes older texts, there are sometimes more complicated sentences. The structure of the sentences sometimes are a little bit more complex with additional phrases and clauses. And it's helpful for me sometimes just to strip out some of those extra phrases and strip it down to the subject and the verb. Because the first thing I think that is really important that you do is try to figure out what is he saying. If you could paraphrase it in your own words, that's really helpful, really understanding, just comprehending. And then why does he choose to open his speech this way? Or if you're picking a different section, if you're talking about the end, why does he choose to end his speech that way? But the whole questioning of why does he make those particular choices? And then the third and fourth bullet are similar. How would his audience probably feel about these opening lines? How would they receive those lines? And why are they effective in preparing them to hear what he has to say? So they're kind of the same. So I'm just looking at the first sentence, and you can see that he's actually saying nobody thinks more highly of the people who just spoke. So I know he had listened to some of his fellow delegates, and then he stands up to speak. And the first thing he does is he compliments them and talks about how they're patriotic and they're very able and they're worthy. And then the second sentence, he kind of triggers with the word but. And so I'm thinking, oh, okay, so there's going to be a shift. So yes, they're patriotic and they're able and they're worthy, but. So, okay, so there's a shift going on there. And then he talks about how people have different opinions and how he thinks it's important that they know he's not trying to be disrespectful, but his opinion is going to be very opposite. And he wants to be able to speak without reserve. So why does he choose to open his speech that way? So again, I'm thinking, okay, well, he's talking to other grown men, other delegates who are educated. He probably wants them, nobody wants to get up or nobody wants to listen to somebody attack them. But by saying you guys are very worthy and very, able, he probably thinks that that's a way for them to kind of let down their guard and be more open to what he has to say, which kind of goes into the third and fourth bullet too. They probably feel like he's respecting them, so therefore we should be respectful in return, because just as we've earned the respect that we have, he probably deserves the respect as well. And going back to what we know about the speaker in the previous slide, he's a statesman, he's a respected attorney, so they do have some level of respect and trust for him. And then lastly, why are Henry's choices effective in preparing them to hear what he has to say? So very similar again, they probably would be less on guard, less defensive, knowing that he respects them and recognizes their worthiness. Okay, so you want to make sure that you are taking those ideas and finding a way to put them into writing as commentary. And I think it's really important to remember that the prompt is always going to be something like analyze how the rhetorical choices achieve purpose or convey tone. So you're not critiquing and saying he did a really effective job or he was really ineffective here. You're not criticizing it. They're always going to give you a text that did effectively sway the audience, and your job is to analyze how or why those choices were effective in swaying the audience. So I pasted the passage back here again so you don't have to go back and forth. But I highlighted in kind of this teal color some of the phrasing that stands out, and I talked about it a little bit already, but talking about the praising, being patriotic and worthy, and then talking about what his hope is, not to be thought disrespectful, but to be able to speak freely, just as they had done, the other delegates had done. So this is an example of what might come about as commentary. So I'll kind of read through it and then I'll talk about what my thinking was. Patrick Henry opens his speech deliberately showing respect to his fellow delegates by praising their patriotism as well as their abilities and noting they are worthy gentlemen. While he is well aware some men in the room have opinions very opposite to his, he wants them to be open to listening to him. Therefore, he intentionally acknowledges his respect for them, so they will be more likely to return that respect by maintaining an open mind. He also anticipates that some might take offense to his words, so he addresses that possibility directly. I hope it will not be thought disrespectful, and then closes that sentence with his intent to simply speak forth freely and without reserve. Because he already clarified that he means no disrespect, his audience would be more likely to entertain his sentiments. So again, they're kind of, I'm thinking Patrick Henry is in the same sort of level as the other delegates. So of course, they all feel that they're worthy of respect. So by acknowledging that from the beginning, he is setting them up to be more open, which is what I talked about. And notice that I wove in some of the phrasing. The first piece of textual evidence is just phrasing from the line, didn't do the whole sentence. But the second one, where it starts with, I hope it will not be thought disrespectful, and then kind of added on the latter part too, to show you some different ways that you might embed your textual evidence. And it's also important to really remember that you're focusing on purpose. So keep tying back to purpose. We're going to do one more. So this one comes sort of in the middle. And it says, I ask gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet us upon us those chains which British ministry have been so long forging. So again, in thinking aloud, I highlighted in teal the part that I thought was interesting. And I could have talked about the rhetorical questions because he does that a lot. But then as I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, well, what am I going to say about that in terms of commentary? He asks these questions and it forces the reader to listen, or the listener to listen and consider answers. And that is certainly true. But I thought I'd tackle the latter part instead. So this is what I came up with. And I'll read through it and then I'll talk through my thinking. As Henry provides specific details for his fellow delegates to consider, he both poses and answers leading questions about Britain's treatment of the colonies, leaving little doubt as to the king's true intentions. To underscore what he believes to be the dreadful future the colonists will face if they do not fight back, he assures them the British troops will bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry have been so long forging. Since many white colonists owned slaves themselves, they were familiar with the horror of people bound in chains. Thus, this prediction would stir both their emotions of fear and their sense of obligations as husbands and fathers to protect their loved ones from such horrific fate of bondage and subservience. Furthermore, Henry's insistence that the British have been so long forging this plan emphasizes his belief that the British government had been long preparing for this moment, which effectively conveys a strong sense of urgency to act immediately and to begin to fight back against the troops in New England. So a couple things. First of all, I want to reiterate that your job is to analyze the language and how it achieves purpose. So while we are probably very tempted to say, wow, isn't that ironic and disgusting that many of these colonists own slaves themselves and yet they don't want to be enslaved? That is true and it's a valid observation, but again, it's not the prompt. So we really want to focus on why did it work for this particular audience in this particular time. So that's why I came up with the part about they did own slaves, and so many of them did. The second thing is you'll notice that I didn't say he uses pathos and he uses ethos. Instead, I said this prediction would stir both their emotions of fear, which is pathos, and their sense of obligation, which is ethos. But we really want to avoid that uses pathos, uses ethos, because we're really talking about how does the language elicit the feelings and the sense of obligation. And notice at the end too, it ties back to purpose, the urgency to act immediately to begin to fight back against troops in England, because that is what your whole focus is. How does the language achieve purpose? And that purpose should kind of stay central to your paper. So that's it. I hope that helped. You can feel free to listen to it again if you need more support or more time to focus.